Hey there, it's Andrea, and welcome to the Voice of Influence podcast. Today, I'm looking forward to speaking with Louis K. Gump. He is a business leader, a transformational leader, and a pragmatic optimist, which the world is in desperate need for right now. He is the author of the hot new release, the book, The Inside Innovator, A Practical Guide to Intrapreneurship. Gump is president of Cambian Solutions, which focuses on excellence in innovation, business growth, and team performance. Earlier in his career, he presided over award winning mobile businesses at the Weather Channel and CNN. More recently, he has served as CEO of two digital media firms and led Cox Media, the advertising division of Cox Communications, the third largest cable provider in the US. Gump has also held leadership roles in a wide range of industry and community organizations. It is so good to have you here on the podcast, Louis. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Andrea. It's a real pleasure to join you today.
Okay, so entrepreneurship, it's this like sexy term that this concept that come on up with an idea and build a business around it, then sell the company and find some way to create passive income so you can lay on the beach somewhere and run your business. Uh But you're talking about entrepreneurship. So I would love for you to share with us to just start off, what exactly is entrepreneurship and what do you see the difference between entrepreneurship and intrapreneurship?
Sure, happy to comment on that. First, the definition of entrepreneurship is pretty straightforward. It is the practice of creating value through innovation and growth within a larger organization. Again, it's the practice of creating value through innovation and growth within a larger organization. And if you'd asked me that question a year ago, I probably would have taken a couple of minutes to answer. And as I did research for the book and talked with a lot of people and thought back on my own experience, it occurred to me that there should be a really simple way to describe this. One of the ways that it's also been described, and this is by Gifford Pinchot, who wrote the book Intrapreneuring in 1985, he described entrepreneurs as dreamers who do,
Mm,
people who imagine things, but then find ways to make them happen. And I think that's really important. Going to your point about the distinction between entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship, there are actually several of them. One of them is the size and scope of organizations. The typical entrepreneur is working in an organization. It could be a for-profit company, it could be a nonprofit, could be an educational institution or other, that's been around for a while. It has multiple divisions. It often has an existing line of business, and then an entrepreneur is building something new within that organization. Also, the processes for approving something new tend to be very different in a large organization than if you're an entrepreneur. If you're an entrepreneur, typically you're the owner or founder or both of an organization, and you can look at it. Entrepreneurs do great work in many, many cases, and what they do is very important. They tend to have more control and more, an ability to make decisions faster in many cases. So you're looking at difference in process. Another thing that's a difference is the resources at the disposal of an entrepreneur. If you look at a typical entrepreneur, especially one earlier in the journey, and I've experienced this personally as well as knowing a lot of people who have done it, you might be just trying to figure out how to get insurance for your team members. You might be trying to figure out how to build your first product. As an entrepreneur, usually you have some of the basics covered. You likely have an HR department. You likely have legal. You might have a marketing department and other things. You also have existing lines of business with experience attached to a larger brand. So you have many, many assets. And one of the other differences, and this came up again in so many conversations, is that entrepreneurship for many people is the just right level of risk for somebody who really wants to make a big difference.
mm.
They want to drive change. They want to work with a talented team. They also want to work with a company that has other resources. So if it takes longer or things go in a different direction, then they still have the opportunity to work with the company and engage over a longer period of time.
Mhm. And what a important time in our, in history to be talking about this subject. I mean, companies are just clamoring, trying to figure out or put into place new ways of handling things like AI. So, what are you seeing? Are you seeing this trend, or is there a trend? Can you tell? Are there metrics involved with that you're aware of around entrepreneurship, or what are you seeing?
It's funny that you ask. There's a question that I have open. If anybody listening to this podcast has the answer, please let me know. I'm easy to find on my website. But the question is this: how many entrepreneurs are there in the world?
Yeah.
How many entrepreneurs are there in the United States? And pick your geography otherwise. I don't have a good answer to that. I did speak with someone earlier this week who had an estimate for people they refer to as catalysts. Um, and for people who act as catalysts, I think their estimate was maybe 8 to 11% of the people in an environment. Now, that's not the exact same thing as an entrepreneur, but what I think I can say for sure is it's less than 10%, or I can say confidently, not for sure, but confidently, it's likely less than 10% of the total people out there because there's so many characteristics that are required to be a successful entrepreneur. And also, you need the right environment to do it successfully. And so, what
Exactly.
I can tell you, however, is that entrepreneurs often are working on lines of business and initiatives that account for less than 1% of the total revenue of a larger organization. And they're also often working on the businesses that and initiatives that 5 to 10 years from now could be the majority of revenue. So they're essentially helping to build the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, there's so many questions that I have about this subject and about your book. But first, can you kind of give us an idea of how your own personal career path led you to write this book? It's quite fascinating.
I'd be happy to. So I'll share a little bit about my background and then go on to the kind of the decision point where I went from someday maybe to I'm committed on the book. And in the case of career path, there's a longer version of the story, but a shorter one starts at the Weather Channel in 2001. And I had worked in a couple of smaller firms. I'd worked in consulting, among other things. By the way, I'd also pulled pallet jacks in a warehouse and swept the floors and gone on truck runs. So a lot of different types of jobs over the years. But at the Weather Channel, I was responsible for making agreements and creating partnerships with companies like ABC News and Yahoo, along with our talented teammates. And it was a business development role. And it was perfect because it combined the opportunity to build relationships, the opportunity to create new lines of business, and the opportunity to tap into the products that we had, especially with weather.com for the desktop at the time. And then I rapidly ended up having an opportunity to focus on mobile. And that led to 8 years of mostly focus on mobile at the Weather Channel. The
About
Weather,
what time period was this? Like, just anchor us in the time frame.
sure. So I arrived at the Weather Channel in January of 2001. So
Okay.
this was just after kind of the dot when the dot bust, and it was a very mixed marketplace at that point. And companies were trying to figure out how to navigate through so much innovation that was happening with technology, especially with the internet. And the internet had proven itself to be a force to stay, but mobile was still emerging, especially mobile data. In fact, at that time, it wasn't unusual for people not to have a mobile phone. More and more people were having the phones, but they were using them mostly to talk. If you think about the way people use them today, a lot of it is the data as well. So we ended up building the business. We had a hypothesis that mobile was going to be big someday. That turned out to be right. But we also had an intention not just to build a successful mobile business, but to complement the brand of the Weather Channel, which is one of the most trusted brands in the country. And that was something that was very important to us throughout, and it was part of the entrepreneurial journey. So I stayed until 2009, and then CNN expressed interest in my going to work with them to lead CNN Mobile globally. And that was a situation where obviously CNN is well known for news coverage. There are so many other things that we could say about this very creative brand that Ted Turner had started years before. The TV network was going strong. CNN.com had been growing, and they really wanted to make sure that mobile did justice to the brand. And so we had an opportunity to build there. And at the time, again, with an incredible team, we wrote the strategy, hired more people, launched products. We launched CNN's first iPhone app, first Android app, first iPad app. And this was after I had done some similar work with a team at the Weather Channel. And so we essentially helped CNN get to a place where it was very strong in that area. And then I went to pursue a longtime dream. And this provided some interesting contrast. I led a small company that was focused on local mobile advertising. We sold the company. We had a transaction within the next couple of years. I was doing some consulting with the company that did that transaction, Raycom Media. And Raycom asked if I would be interested in joining a small company that they and other new broadcasters had invested in. We built that into one of the top 5 providers of news and information on Roku within a year. That was
Mm.
quite the experience. Sold it to one of our investors. And then I stayed for a couple of years, went to Cox Media, once again, a large company with offices from coast to coast, where we focused on a digital transformation for the advertising division of a cable company. So, with that as background, I left Cox in August of 2022 with the idea of taking a 4-month sabbatical, and I was really ready. I mean, we had been, working so hard, and COVID had been a significant part of that experience, and I just wanted to plug in with family, give back to the community and whatnot. About 2, 3 months in, I had been reflecting on what was next. I thought I was going to go find another great company and team and join with them to hopefully climb a mountain that's worth climbing. And then I thought, you know what? That book that I've been thinking about for a long time, maybe it's time. And in November of 22, I committed to writing the book. I've spent a large portion of the past year focused on that, and we just launched it last week
Okay, November 22 was when ChatGPT came out, isn't it?
in that neighborhood.
Yeah. I mean, like, the good timing. And congratulations launching the book last week, and you've had some really good success already with it. There's so many different things that come to my mind through all this. Your experience in particular is so fascinating to me. I'm wondering, did you like what kind of road bumps did you come across in organizations as you were building these new products and new things? You were being the entrepreneur, you were building a team around you, all that. Um, what were some of the biggest roadblocks that you came across, and how did you navigate those?
That is a great question. There are a lot of ways to answer that question. And I'm going to try to answer your question literally, focus on a few types of road bumps.
Sure.
The first one is team building, and that includes a broad definition of team, not just the people we hired, but also the people we relied on and worked closely with within the broader organization. And not just that, but also our partners. Because as an entrepreneur, you don't typically have the luxury of having all the resources you need right at your disposal. The second one is how you get approval for things in a larger organization. Because you can have a great idea, but you can also, there are 100 ways to be stopped and then some.
Yeah.
Okay. And then I would say communication overall is fertile ground for road bumps because along the way, there are just so many ways to either elevate a venture or to go sideways, some or a lot. And so with the first, with team building, we had to be very thoughtful about our goals. When we understood the goals and then we had some direction, then we could go about assembling the right group of people and the order, because sometimes you want to focus on a product, and often that's the case. Sometimes you need to start with technology. Sometimes you need to start with business partners. For example, if you're a media company and you're working with a wireless carrier, you can't really advance a whole lot until you know what the specs are for the app you're building for a certain handset, for example. Okay. With approvals, I cannot tell you how many pitches I've made and how many discussions I've been in where somebody else was pitching to me or we were doing it together to say, hey, we've got this idea for a service or a product or an initiative, and we think it's important because of X. And to do that, there's a pretty well proven process. I outlined this some in my book about how you take an idea or an aspiration and turn it into a condensed summary of the ideas, and then share that in a language that other people on the receiving end will find familiar. And that can be everything from standard business terms around products and financial metrics to even using a SWOT analysis.
Hmm.
And then with communication, it's tough to drive change. From time to time, people use the analysis or the analogy of a virus. It's like if you're driving change and there's a big organism, it'll look at you and say, "Hey, what's this thing? We don't recognize it here." And so,
Yeah.
figuring out a way to go from the perception that disruptive force with a question mark to friendly advocate is very, very important. And doing that along the way requires a mix of vision, it requires empathy, it requires humility, and it requires a lot of communication. One of the people I interviewed pointed out that an entrepreneur has to be a chameleon some of the time with communication because, certain people, and I'm not going to name functional groups because there's a little bit of stereotyping involved, but there are trends. There are certain functional groups that just like the down and dirty. It's like, tell us what you need, when you need it, and how. And other groups really want to talk it through. And if you say, well, I'm just a no nonsense somebody and I don't care what people think, I'm going to tell it like it is all the time. That's fine. You can choose to do that, but you're going to make your path harder. And you have a choice to make about whether you want to be adaptable or not. I'm
Hmm.
not saying you have to. I'm just saying there are ways to make it easier and more effective. And lastly, one of the things that I would say, which gets to the reasons I wrote the book, there are ways to do this and be successful and yet frustrated. And there are ways to do this and be successful and also more fulfilled. And my perspective on being an entrepreneur is that this really can be one of the most fulfilling and interesting career paths one can take on. And it's important to put boundaries on time. It's important to prioritize. And it's important to understand that your own fulfillment is important even as you focus on contribution to the organization.
Why would you say that? Why is your own fulfillment important?
I think it's fairly fundamental because, as we look at different career paths, um, there are many ways to tap into one's strengths and to acknowledge one's weaknesses. At last I checked, none of us get a pass and we just, perfect in every way. So we're going to have our mix. And if you do the inner work first, so that you understand yourself and say, hey, does this work for me generally? And does this work for me at a given time? Then it has several benefits. One of them is that you kind of feel better, you feel happier, you feel more resonant. That one is less tangible, but it's critically important. It's especially critically important because of the practical manifestation of what happens then. And that is you tend to do better work and you tend to build stronger relationships. When you do better work, it's kind of a virtuous circle. It just or to use a Jim Collinsism, the flywheel starts to go. One good thing turns into another, and some people who are really great at this, they are literally serial intrapreneurs.
Hmm.
People who are so good at it and so successful, they do it again and again. And also at the same time, Andrea, what happens is that as an entrepreneur, because of some of the challenges and opportunities, it's easy to tweak relationships. It's easy to have people get frustrated for one reason or another. And I'm going to tell you, it's impossible, as the proverb says, to make all the people happy all the time. But there are definitely ways to help more people be happier more of the time and have stronger relationships, which in turn helps you drive better outcomes for yourself, for your team, and for your customers.
Mm. Yes. Yeah, and I really, I found for myself, and I think that I've seen this, for most people really care about having connection and impact. And it's sometimes it can feel like those 2 things are in conflict with one another because when you are the disruptor, when you're that disruptive force and you're wanting to be, changing that into the friendly advocate like you said earlier, um, that's crucial to your own personal ability to continue to go and your resilience and yeah, so I love everything that you just said about that.
Thank you. And if I could add something else, which to me, it's very, very important. It's additional layers. One is family and friends. When you're fulfilled at work, it's easier to show up as you really are and want to be with the people you care about most outside
So
of the
true.
professional environment. And lastly, it's very beneficial for a community too. When you're
Mm.
fulfilled and active and successful, you're more able to give back. So they're just layers of goodness there.
Mhm. When you were just starting out with the Weather Channel, did you already have a lot of knowledge about mobile? Did you know about that, or was it why were you chosen for that, or how did you get into that position?
I knew so little about mobile. I knew how to turn on a phone and how to send a text. And, that's an important question too, because some entrepreneurs will come into a role with a lot of domain knowledge. And that's okay. And it's often beneficial. However, a lot of knowledge also can be a hindrance at times. And so my perspective is that it's more helpful if you have to choose to have a framework for thinking about opportunities and solving problems than it is to have specific domain knowledge. Specific domain knowledge can be gained a lot of the time. Relationships are harder, by the way. It takes more time to build them. But I'll share with you that, years before I was working with a shipping company and we had to figure out a way to use EDI, electronic data interchange. I'd never used it before, but we had talented people. We had some technology experts and we gathered together and figured it out. Same thing with client server systems. Same thing with the web, the desktop based internet, and same thing about mobile. So if you have some strong problem solving skills and a talented team, sky's the limit.
Mhm. So, what does a business need to do in order to encourage entrepreneurship? And I don't know if we're always talking about that person that's doing the big, huge project. I would imagine that there's also some kind of people doing entrepreneurial work without having this, carrying forth this big, huge change. What can a company do to encourage that kind of environment? Or do they
Uh,
wanna encourage that kind of environment, or do they just wanna encourage those people?
it's such an important set of questions. The what does a business need to do is a question that more companies and more senior leaders ought to be asking in terms of helping entrepreneurs to be successful and to facilitate entrepreneurship. It's in their best interest and it's just a generally positive thing to do. I want to answer one part of your kind of set of questions there quickly, and that is this is not just for the big initiative. This can be for smaller improvements. This can be for the person who is finding ways to make incremental improvements. The most visible ways that entrepreneurship, is seen and known, and the value is seen and known. They tend to be some of the bigger initiatives, but entrepreneurship itself is not limited to that. And in fact, I interviewed Quint Studer for my book. He's a successful healthcare executive, author, minor league baseball team owner, and more. And he told me a story about his dad who worked on diesel engines at for trains at General Electric, and his dad became the best repair person in GE as far as he knew. As far as he knew at all, they would fly his dad from one place to another to fix problems that other people hadn't, and he was constantly coming up with ideas on how to improve the engines and the process and whatnot. Uh, I would consider him to be an entrepreneur, and what Quint said is that his dad really didn't want to be an entrepreneur. He could have started his own business, could have been a consultant, but he wanted an environment where he was in a bigger company, where he had the team and the resources and the predictability. That was important to him. And so he was an incredible asset to the company. And there are so many people like that today in our work environments if they're just given the opportunity to contribute as well as they can. So I want to make that point. Organizations are not always really good at making entrepreneurship easy. In fact, sometimes if you just step back and did a diagnostic, you might come to the conclusion that they're intentionally making it hard.
Yeah.
Uh, and they aren't necessarily. I think that would be rare, but they're
But it can feel that way.
that's right. It feels that way. You have these big bureaucracies. One of the biggest problems in larger organizations is you have decision-making criteria and processes that are designed for big mature businesses, and they're applied to internal startups. And so you got things like we want to see a return on investment within 6 months, and the revenue needs to be something with at least 7 digits by X time and all this stuff. And that's immediately an invitation to squash new ideas.
Yeah.
And look, I don't think anybody who's done this for a while is missing the point that over time you need something to be big enough and strong enough to work. We're not missing that. But you need to use different criteria for smaller growth opportunities in businesses, emerging ones. Secondly, you need to have a tolerance for failure. A lot of companies are expecting success and they're like, basically there's a value judgment. Success good, failure bad. So what are they going to do? You go toward the metrics. If it's successful, you do more of it, even if it's on a declining business. And if something fails the first or second time, you're like, oh, we tried that, it didn't work, we're done. That's why a lot of promising entrepreneurs who could create million and billion-dollar businesses within their companies go out and start their own,
Yep.
because somebody in some big company didn't have enough vision to understand how that opportunity would match their brand. I'm not saying that every company should accept every idea. Sometimes the best thing is for it to go live in somewhere else. It's important to have a plant in the right flower, right? But a lot of times these big companies have tremendous opportunities, and just because they're too busy or they have the wrong processes, they don't quite capitalize on those. The last thing that I would say for an immediate answer to your question is that senior executives have to walk the talk. The CEO or the equivalent, especially, has to walk the talk because everybody else is taking their cues from that person or small group of people. And if the leader is not just saying innovation is important, which is a start, but it's only a start, but also practicing it and investing it and showing up at the all-day showcase for a gathering of people who have new ideas when they could be doing 100 other things. That's when you start to see companies that might just be able to sustain excellence in entrepreneurship.
Hmm. That's a really good point. It's it's really hard to go against the grain. Do you when I think of people that have ideas and maybe see a potential opportunity, what are your thoughts on those people kind of not just taking the opportunity, but almost making the opportunity for themselves? What kind of credibility do they need to bring to the table that would get them an audience, that would help them to communicate in a way that may potentially create that opportunity for themselves?
All right. So they need credibility and they also need support, is what I would say. One of the ways that entrepreneurs gain credibility is a track record. Sometimes they're more likely to have it than others. But another one is it helps if they've got the core criteria, the core traits that are needed
Mm.
for an entrepreneur. Because if they do, they're naturally going to generate credibility. And I found in my research 5 in particular at the top of the list that are required for pretty much every successful entrepreneur I've seen. I don't know of an exception yet. The number one characteristic is curiosity. An entrepreneur must be curious, be willing to explore, find new paths. The second one is action orientation. That one is closely connected to the answer to your question because an entrepreneur, it's nice that if you're experimenting, exploring, curious, but you need to be able to take ideas and turn them into reality and do that with other people. Which brings me to the third one, the ability to build bridges.
I love
Uh,
this one.
it's so critical, and it's one of the distinctions, at least in relative need, between an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. An entrepreneur sometimes can just say, "I have a great idea." If they have the funding, especially, they can go figure out a way to make it happen. But if you're an entrepreneur, you have to know how to work with a lot of different people. Sometimes they're over, many dozens, over 100 people who could stop you, and you need to know how to build the bridges to people and groups. The fourth one is risk tolerance. An entrepreneur has to have the ability to say, you know what, I'm going to try things. Some of them are going to work well, some of them might not work so well, some of them might not work at all, but we're going to do our best to vet them, and then we're going to get moving and we're going to try things. And lastly, optimism, and in particular, grounded optimism. So you have kind of an idea, you can see the vision, you can explain it, but also you understand what it takes to make it really work. So when you have all those things together, and especially if you then have an idea to work with and some resources, there's a good chance that you're on your way. The other thing that an area that I want to focus on is support from elsewhere within the organization for credibility. When I arrived at the Weather Channel, hopefully I was bringing some skills and some experience that were helpful to our team and our customers. But I wasn't really a known quantity at the time. And I had a boss who was a forceful advocate for what we were doing, how we were going to do it, and for me. And so what I found, and I learned this also in research over and over, most of the people who are successful entrepreneurs not only take initiative and are naturally wired to be successful, but also they find people who will be advocates, could be your boss, could be the CFO, could be the chief marketing officer, could be the person over in technology who just really knows everybody in the organization and says, you ought to listen. Whoever it is, it's not about title, it's not about function, but it's about people who are influencers within the organization who help support and build the momentum for your really great idea.
So good because you don't necessarily have to have everything figured out yourself before you can utilize the influence of others. Yeah, that's great.
I was curious, having listened to your podcast on Amy Poehler in the masterclass, and she talks about the saying yes, be ready to say yes. That really resonated for me. And for me, it was a cousin of this idea that when you're constructing sentences, it's better to say and than but. Let's have a landscape of opportunity. And I was curious to hear more about how that idea of saying yes resonated for you.
Yeah, I think that people who tend to take initiative, they have maybe it's the entrepreneurial kind of spirit, but it's that they have ideas and they can as long as people like go with it and they can move with it, they can experiment, they can try it out. But as soon as somebody comes along and just says no, for whatever reason, shut down the idea, it's really hard to kind of push around that or through that. So that anyway, that's initially what I'm thinking of.
Thank you. I think you touched on it there. What your podcast made me think about is that many entrepreneurs lean toward an answer of yes to start as opposed to no, kind of like Amy Poehler advocates for people who do improv,
Yeah.
and they're totally disconnected. The reason I believe that to be true is because a lot of entrepreneurs are creating things. In fact, most everyone, they're creating things that haven't existed before, or at least they haven't been done that way. And so they have to be open minded enough to say, hey, that might work while retaining their judgment and staying practical so that you can prioritize the best ideas over time.
Mhm. Yeah. And when you were talking about entrepreneurs advocate or like being each other's champions, that's a kind of I thought about that as well. Like when you have that spirit of like, yes, let's try this, let's experiment, let's go, let's put it into play and see what happens. Then you have there's so much, there's so many questions. Where might this go? Is what she said. Where could this end up? And without that, you kind of you come to a dead end quite quickly.
I agree. So thank you for the gift of a new way of thinking about this. I really appreciate.
Okay. So you at the end of your book, you say why the world needs entrepreneurs. I feel like this is such an important question. So if you don't mind, in at least in a succinct way, why does the world need entrepreneurs now?
I love this question. When I started out to write the book, I just wanted to write a book about entrepreneurship. And the reason was I read a lot. I was looking around the landscape. There are some great books on entrepreneurship, some great books on senior level leadership. As I've come to find, there are some that are focused on this general area. I didn't find the practical guide to doing this that I was looking for. And so I chose to write it. And I ended up completing the book and then asking more or less that question: why is it important? And in the conclusion to the book, I identify four themes, and so I have them written down here. And this is just a concise summary. Although we could talk all day about what they mean and how to act on them. But the first is entrepreneurs push established organizations to adapt. Entrepreneurs, in other words, are people who help organizations to move toward the future, whether they want to or even if they're reluctant to do it. The second one is entrepreneurs train the next generation of leaders. This is something that I did not predict, although in hindsight, it looks really obvious. What ends up happening is that a lot of people have the opportunity to stretch their capabilities, to contribute to companies, to do things that they didn't even know they could do. And in the process, they become some of the most talented and experienced people and qualified people to lead in the future. The third one is entrepreneurs create transformative growth opportunities for entrepreneurs. This is another one that's obvious in hindsight, but I wouldn't have kind of, elevated it to one of the top findings early on in the writing process. What happened in my experience over and over again is that entrepreneurs needed help. They didn't have all the resources at their disposal. And where did they look? For creative people who were building something that was a, really great company or idea somewhere else. And especially they were doing that when this idea needed a bunch of different customers. It didn't scale really well if it's inside. And so uh, entrepreneurs can help entrepreneurs succeed in really extraordinary ways. And by the same token, entrepreneurs can help entrepreneurs achieve their goals faster and better than any other way. So it's a virtuous circle. And the last one is entrepreneurs drive value creation within the organization. I love the description from one of the people I interviewed last year, where he said, "Hey, Lewis, we understand that what we're working on today is less than 1% of the value of the organization. And that's okay. We're a really big company. But on the other hand, we know that this thing we're working on now, as I had referenced earlier in our conversation, might be one of the most important parts of our company within a few years. So it's important to act on now so we're ready for the future."
Mm, yeah. Okay, so where can people find you and your book, Lewis?
Oh, thank you for asking. So they can find me at lewisgump.com, LOUISGUMP.com. They can order the book online at a favorite bookseller. And also, we are available in selected bookstores nationwide. And, we're going to try to be a resource. So please keep an eye out. Oh, and I should probably mention LinkedIn. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn as well.
Yes, and the book again, we'll link to all this in the show notes, but the book again, the title of it is The Inside Innovator: A Practical Guide to Intrapreneurship. Lewis, I have one last question for you. What last piece of advice would you want to give somebody who wants to have a voice of influence?
I want to think about that one because there are so many different ways for someone to have a voice of influence, and especially in the context of this podcast. And my default is a little counterintuitive.
Great.
And that, If someone wants to have a voice of influence, they should be a superior listener. If someone wants to speak with authority, if someone wants to be persuasive, if someone wants to be convincing, if somebody wants to understand what's needed by the other person or people or groups, then they should really understand to the best of their ability what the landscape is and what the context is for their comments. And if they do that, then the voice of influence, grows. The ability to influence grows in a really positive way, and it magnifies over time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for this great conversation. Thank you for taking time to write your book and to talk with us today.
You're welcome, Andrea. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.